On August 9th, 48 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar stood on a dusty Greek plain with 22,000 exhausted legionaries facing 45,000 of Rome's finest troops, commanded by the greatest general of the age. By sunset, the Roman Republic would be dead. Caesar would be master of the known world. And 1,000 years of history would pivot on what happened in the next 90 minutes. Think about those numbers for a second. 22,000 against 45,000. Pompey had more than double Caesar's strength. His cavalry outnumbered Caesar's 7-1. He held the high ground, fresh water, and unlimited supplies. Caesar's men hadn't eaten in 2 days. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how Caesar turned certain annihilation into total victory. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see Roman warfare forever. First, the secret 4th line that Caesar invented on the morning of battle. Second, why Pompey's 7,000 cavalry fled in terror after a single clash. And third, the moment Caesar's veterans realized they were about to become legends. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did Caesar convince starving men to charge uphill into twice their numbers? What tactical innovation broke the unbreakable Roman cavalry? Why did Pompey abandon his army while the battle was still raging? How did a civil war between Romans become the bloodiest massacre in Republican history? To understand how Caesar destroyed the Republic and created an empire, we need to go back to when Rome itself was tearing apart at the seams. January 10th, 49 BC. The Rubicon River marked the boundary between Gaul and Italy. The line no Roman general could cross with an army without declaring war on the Senate itself. Caesar stood on the northern bank with a single legion, the 13th, staring at the shallow water that separated him from either absolute power or total destruction. Behind him lay a decade of conquest in Gaul. Victories that had made him the most popular man in Rome and the most feared. Ahead lay Pompey the Great, the Senate's champion, the man they called the teenage butcher for his early campaigns, Rome's greatest living general. The Senate had ordered Caesar to disband his legions and return to Rome alone to face trial on charges that everyone knew were political assassination disguised as law. Caesar understood what that meant. Exile at best, execution at worst. So he made a choice that would drown the Roman Republic in blood. He crossed. Think about what that single decision triggered. One man, one river, one moment. Within hours, couriers were racing south toward Rome with news that would shatter 5 centuries of Republican government. Caesar had just declared war on the state itself. The penalty for what he'd done was death, his property confiscated, his name erased from history. There was no going back, no negotiation, no political solution. Rome would have civil war, and one of the 2 greatest generals alive would have to die. Here's what makes this moment truly insane. Caesar crossed with only 5,000 men. The 13th Legion, understrength, exhausted from years of campaign in Gaul, carrying weapons that needed sharpening and armor that needed repair. That was his invasion force. Meanwhile, Pompey commanded legions across Italy, controlled the Senate, held Rome's treasury, and had the full weight of the Roman state behind him. The arithmetic was brutal. Caesar was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and by every rational calculation, should have been crushed within weeks. But Pompey made his first critical mistake. He underestimated the speed of Caesar's advance. Roman military doctrine assumed armies moved at 15 miles per day, maximum. Caesar's legions, force-marched by a general who'd spent a decade teaching them to move like lightning, covered 25 miles per day. They swept through northern Italy before Pompey's defensive positions could be established. Towns opened their gates without resistance. Pompey's recruiting officers fled south, abandoning their posts. Within 3 weeks, Caesar controlled everything north of Rome itself. Pompey, facing an enemy who refused to play by traditional rules, made a decision that shocked the Senate. He abandoned Rome, just packed up, took the consuls, grabbed whatever legions he could muster, and fled to Greece. The Senate, Rome's governing body for 500 years, evacuated the city and followed Pompey into exile. Think about that. The capital of the known world, left undefended because its greatest general decided he couldn't win a battle there. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about that evacuation. Pompey wasn't running from Caesar's 5,000 men. He was running from Caesar's reputation. For 10 years, Caesar had fought in Gaul, Germania, and Britain. He'd defeated the Helvetii, the Germanic tribes, the Belgae, and countless others. He'd never lost a battle where he personally commanded. His legionaries worshipped him, not because he was kind, but because following Caesar meant victory, plunder, and glory. Pompey looked at Caesar's track record and realized that fighting him in Italy, where Caesar was popular and Pompey's support was uncertain, was suicide. So Pompey fled to Greece, taking Rome's treasury, 40,000 talents of gold and silver, enough wealth to hire every mercenary in the Mediterranean. He controlled the fleet, which meant he controlled the seas. He had time, resources, and space to build an army that would dwarf anything Caesar could field. His plan was brilliant. Let Caesar hold Italy, let him struggle with governing, let his supplies run out, then return with overwhelming force and crush him. But Pompey's evacuation did something he didn't anticipate. It made Caesar look like Rome's savior, and Pompey look like a coward. The political war was lost at the moment Pompey abandoned the city. Now all that remained was the military war. And that war would culminate on a dusty Greek plain 17 months later, where the fate of the known world would be decided in 90 minutes of steel and blood. The question wasn't whether Rome would have a civil war. The question was which general would survive it. And as Caesar marched his legion south toward Rome's empty Senate house, he already knew the answer. For 17 months, Caesar pursued Pompey across the Mediterranean world like a wolf hunting a lion. Pompey fled to Greece, taking the Senate, Rome's treasury, and most of the Republic's military resources with him. Caesar followed with an army that was outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. Pompey's strategy was deliberate. He controlled the seas through his admiral Bibulus, who commanded 500 warships. He controlled Greece's food supplies. He had 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, veterans from campaigns across the east. Time was on Pompey's side. Every day Caesar spent in Greece was another day his supply lines stretched thinner, another day his political enemies consolidated power in Rome, another day his soldiers went hungry. Caesar knew the arithmetic. He needed battle. Pompey needed only to wait. But Caesar had spent a decade turning legionaries into the deadliest fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. And he was about to prove that discipline, training, and tactical genius could overcome impossible odds. The naval blockade should have ended Caesar's campaign before it started. Bibulus positioned his 500 warships across the Adriatic, creating a maritime wall that no army could cross. Every port was watched, every beach was patrolled. Roman naval doctrine held that moving an army by sea without naval superiority was suicide. Caesar did it anyway. On January 4th, 48 BC, using commandeered merchant vessels and fishing boats, Caesar loaded 7 legions, roughly 35,000 men, and attempted to cross the Adriatic in winter. Think about that decision. Winter crossing of the Adriatic was considered impossible. Storms routinely sank entire fleets. But Caesar gambled that Bibulus wouldn't expect an attack during the worst sailing season of the year. He was right. Caesar's makeshift fleet slipped through the blockade in darkness and fog. By the time Bibulus realized what had happened, Caesar had landed in Greece with 7 legions. Bibulus, enraged by the failure, captured Caesar's empty transport ships on their return voyage and burned them. All of them, 300 vessels, turned to ash. The message was clear. Caesar wasn't getting reinforcements. His 35,000 men were trapped in Greece, cut off from Italy, with no supply line and no escape route. Here's where Caesar's situation went from desperate to catastrophic. His remaining legions, under Mark Antony's command, were stuck in Italy with no way to cross. Caesar had 35,000 men in Greece, facing Pompey's 52,000. The math was brutal, but it got worse. Pompey controlled every supply depot in Greece. His quartermasters had stockpiled enough grain to feed his army for a year. Caesar's men were carrying 30 days of rations, and those 30 days were running out fast. By March, Caesar's legionaries were on half rations. By April, they were eating grass, boiled leather, and a paste made from roots that caused dysentery. Soldiers started collapsing during marches. Disease spread through the camps. Desertions began, first in 1s and 2s, then in entire units. Caesar tried everything. He sent foraging parties that returned empty-handed. He attempted to negotiate with Greek cities for supplies and was refused. He even tried to grow crops, planting fields around his fortifications, knowing the harvest wouldn't come in time, but desperate to show his men he had a plan. Pompey watched from his fortified camps and smiled. His strategy was working perfectly. Caesar's army was dying, not from combat, but from hunger. Every week, Caesar grew weaker. Every week, Pompey's position strengthened. The Senate in exile, camped with Pompey, began celebrating prematurely. They drew up prescription lists, naming Caesar's supporters who would be executed when they returned to Rome. They divided Caesar's estates among themselves. They planned triumph celebrations. But here's what those aristocratic senators didn't understand about Caesar's legionaries. These men had followed him through the Alps in winter. They'd built a bridge across the Rhine River in 10 days. They'd invaded Britain twice, sailing across a sea their ancestors believed ended at the edge of the world. They'd defeated the Nervi when outnumbered 3-1, fought back-to-back in a circle for 8 hours, and won. They weren't going to quit because they were hungry. Caesar walked through his camps every evening, talking to his men, sharing their rations, sleeping in the same mud. He told them the same thing every night. Quote, 0. His centurions, veterans who'd served with him for a decade, believed him. And that belief, against all logic and military science, held the army together. But Caesar needed Pompey to fight. He needed it desperately. Because in another month, maybe 2, even Roman discipline wouldn't stop starvation from destroying his army. And then, in late July, Pompey's aristocratic advisors made the mistake that would doom them all. They demanded battle. Pompey the Great was 58 years old, a legend who had conquered pirates, defeated Mithridates, and reorganized the eastern provinces. He'd been hailed as the Roman Alexander, the teenage prodigy who'd won his first triumph at 24. But Pompey, in 48 BC, was not the general he'd been at 24. He was cautious, politically entangled with the aristocratic Senate faction, and surrounded by advisors who insisted Caesar was a rabble-rousing criminal who would collapse under sustained pressure. Caesar, at 52, was different. He'd spent 9 years in Gaul fighting battles where defeat meant death, leading from the front, writing military manuals at night, and forging his legions into instruments of absolute lethality. His men didn't just follow orders, they anticipated them. They didn't just fight, they executed tactical innovations that rewrote Roman military doctrine. The two greatest generals Rome had ever produced were about to collide on a battlefield that would decide the fate of civilization itself. And only one would walk away. Pompey's military record was genuinely staggering. At age 23, he'd raised 3 legions on his own authority, without Senate approval, to fight in Sulla's civil war. At 24, he'd crushed Sulla's enemies in Africa so completely that Sulla himself granted him a triumph, making Pompey the youngest Roman to receive that honor in centuries. He'd cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in just 3 months, a feat that had seemed impossible. He'd defeated Mithridates, the 6th of Pontus, who'd killed 80,000 Roman citizens in a single day, and survived 3 wars against Rome. Pompey had reorganized the entire eastern Mediterranean, creating provinces, installing client kings, and establishing Roman power from Syria to the Black Sea. His wealth was legendary. His political connections were unmatched. His reputation preceded him like thunder. But here's what the Senate aristocrats surrounding Pompey didn't see. Their general had spent the last decade in Rome playing politics, not fighting wars. He'd grown comfortable, wealthy, cautious. The teenage butcher who charged into battle without hesitation had become a 58-year-old politician who calculated every move through the lens of how it would affect his reputation. Pompey's last real combat command had been against Mithridates 14 years ago. 14 years of peace, politics, and growing disconnection from the brutal reality of Roman warfare. Caesar, by contrast, had spent the last 9 years at war constantly. He'd fought the Helvetii, who'd fielded 368,000 warriors, including women and children. He'd defeated Ariovistus and his Germanic coalition of 120,000 tribesmen. He'd crushed the Belgae, 230,000 warriors who the Romans considered the fiercest fighters in Gaul. He'd built a bridge across the Rhine in 10 days, invaded Germania, then burned the bridge behind him just to prove Rome could reach anywhere. He'd crossed the English Channel twice, something no Roman army had attempted before. Think about that sustained combat experience. 9 years, nearly continuous warfare, dozens of battles, each one requiring adaptation, innovation, and absolute commitment. Here's where the difference becomes critical. Pompey commanded his armies from headquarters, sending orders through subordinates. Caesar fought in the front lines. Roman historians record multiple instances where Caesar personally grabbed shields from retreating soldiers and led counterattacks himself. He knew his centurions by name. He knew which cohorts could be trusted for suicide missions and which needed careful handling. His soldiers had seen him bleed, seen him risk death alongside them, seen him share their rations during shortages. Pompey's soldiers served Rome and the Senate. Caesar's soldiers served Caesar. That loyalty gap would prove decisive. But the tactical difference was even more profound. Pompey fought using traditional Roman doctrine: 3-line formation, cavalry on the flanks, infantry in the center, straightforward application of superior numbers and discipline. He was brilliant at it, but it was conventional brilliance. Caesar invented new tactics constantly. In Gaul, he'd developed the circumvallation technique, building walls around besieged cities while simultaneously building walls facing outward to defend against relief armies. At Alesia, he'd built 25 miles of fortifications in 30 days, then held them against 400,000 Gauls. He'd trained his infantry to fight cavalry by aiming for horses' faces. He'd created mixed formations of heavy and light infantry that could adapt mid-battle. Pompey studied war as a science. Caesar treated it as improvisation. Pompey commanded armies. Caesar created weapons. And in 48 BC, those two philosophies were about to clash directly for the first time. The Senate faction believed Pompey's experience, resources, and numerical superiority guaranteed victory. They were about to learn that conventional superiority means nothing against a general who rewrites the rules of engagement in real time. The stage was set. Two generals, two armies, two visions of what Rome should become. One believed in the Republic, the Senate, traditional power structures. The other believed that Rome belonged to whoever could command the legion's absolute loyalty. Philosophy would be settled through steel. And the battlefield chosen for this final confrontation would be a place called Pharsalus, where the impossible odds Caesar had faced for months would either destroy him completely or prove that tactical genius could overcome any numerical disadvantage. The Greek plain was waiting. The armies were gathering, and history was about to pivot on 90 minutes of organized slaughter. By late July, 48 BC, Caesar's army was dying. His supply situation had deteriorated from desperate to catastrophic. The men were eating grass, boiled leather, and anything they could scavenge from the Greek countryside. Disease swept through the camps. Desertions began, first in trickles, then in streams. Pompey's strategy of attrition was working. Caesar tried to force battle multiple times, marching his legions into position, challenging Pompey to come down from his fortified camps and fight. Pompey refused. He watched Caesar's army wither like a plant denied water. And he waited for the inevitable collapse. But Caesar's veterans, the men who'd conquered Gaul, who'd built a bridge across the Rhine in 10 days, who'd invaded Britain twice, refused to break. They'd followed Caesar through blizzards in the Alps, through ambushes in German forests, through battles where they'd been outnumbered 10-1. They weren't going to quit now. Still, even Caesar knew he couldn't sustain this much longer. He needed Pompey to fight, or he needed to retreat back to Italy in disgrace. Then Pompey made his first mistake. The numbers were nightmarish. Caesar's 35,000 men were consuming what little food remained at a rate of roughly 300 pounds of grain per day, just to maintain minimal function. They had enough supplies for maybe 2 more weeks. Think about that arithmetic. 2 weeks until his army literally couldn't march anymore. 2 weeks until malnutrition made combat impossible. 2 weeks until Caesar would have to choose between surrender or watching his legions starve to death in front of him. Pompey's quartermasters, meanwhile, were managing supplies for 52,000 men, with stockpiles that could last through winter. Time was a weapon. And Pompey was wielding it with brutal efficiency. The medical situation was catastrophic. Camp physicians reported dysentery cases in the thousands. Men were collapsing during routine marches from simple exhaustion. The paste made from roots that soldiers were eating to fill their stomachs caused violent intestinal reactions. Some legionaries were so weak they couldn't lift their shields. Others developed fevers from drinking contaminated water when clean sources ran out. Caesar's medical tents, normally reserved for combat casualties, were overwhelmed with men dying from disease and starvation. Centurions filed daily reports estimating they were losing 30 to 40 men per day without Pompey's army striking a single blow. Here's what makes Caesar's situation even more impossible. He couldn't retreat. The Roman political system had no mechanism for forgiveness. If Caesar returned to Italy defeated, he'd be prosecuted, stripped of his command, and executed. His supporters in Rome would be proscribed. His family's property would be confiscated. Every veteran who'd followed him across the Rubicon would face charges of treason. There was no political solution, no compromise, no peaceful resolution. Victory or death. Those were the only options. On July 23rd, Caesar tried something desperate. He marched his entire army to within 200 yards of Pompey's fortified camp and formed battle lines. His message was clear: come down and fight, or admit you're afraid. Pompey's soldiers lined the ramparts, watching Caesar's starving legionaries stand in perfect formation under the brutal summer sun. The veterans stood there for 4 hours, shields locked, javelins ready, waiting. Pompey didn't move. He just watched from his headquarters tent, comfortable in the knowledge that every hour Caesar's men stood in the heat, as another hour they burned calories they couldn't replace. Caesar withdrew that evening in perfect order, ranks maintained, discipline intact. But his centurions reported that men were weeping from frustration as they marched back to camp. They understood the mathematics as clearly as their general did. They were the finest fighting force in the world, and they were losing to logistics. But Pompey's senatorial advisors, watching this display of discipline from starving men, came to a different conclusion. They saw Caesar's challenge not as desperation, but as confidence. They saw his veterans maintaining formation despite their condition and became convinced that Caesar must have secret supply lines, hidden reinforcements, some advantage they hadn't detected. The aristocrats began whispering that Pompey was prolonging the war deliberately, afraid to face Caesar in open battle, concerned about his reputation. The pressure on Pompey intensified daily. Senators who'd never commanded troops in their lives questioned his courage in council meetings. They pointed at Caesar's weakened state and demanded immediate attack. They accused Pompey of cowardice, of preserving his own power by extending the conflict. Day after day, the political pressure mounted. And Pompey, the general who'd won through patience and strategic brilliance his entire career, began to buckle under the weight of aristocratic expectation. On August 5th, Pompey called a council of war. The Senate faction attended, dozens of aristocrats crammed into his command tent, all of them demanding action. Pompey tried to explain that Caesar's army would collapse within weeks without battle. The senators wouldn't hear it. Finally, worn down by political pressure and aristocratic contempt, Pompey gave the order that would doom him. He would offer battle at Pharsalus. The date was set for August 9th, 4 days to prepare for the battle that would end the Roman Republic. Pompey's camp wasn't just a military headquarters. It was a mobile senate filled with aristocratic politicians who'd fled Rome and now clustered around Pompey like flies around a carcass. These senators, men like Cato, Scipio, and Lentulus, had never commanded troops in real combat. They viewed warfare as a matter of honor, dignity, and political theater. They looked at Caesar's starving army and saw weakness. They looked at Pompey's numerical superiority and saw inevitable victory. And they began to pressure Pompey to attack. The aristocrats mocked Pompey for his caution. They accused him of prolonging the war to maintain his own power. They whispered that he was afraid of Caesar. Day after day, in council meetings that grew increasingly heated, they demanded battle. Pompey resisted. He knew Caesar's reputation. He knew that Caesar had never lost a battle in Gaul where he personally commanded. But the political pressure was overwhelming. The aristocrats didn't just want Caesar defeated, they wanted him humiliated, crushed, destroyed as an example. Finally, in early August, Pompey gave in. He would offer battle at a place called Pharsalus. Here's what made this situation genuinely insane. The Senate faction in Pompey's camp numbered over 200 men. Former consuls, praetors, tribunes, every single one from Rome's oldest families. Combined, they owned roughly 40% of Italy's arable land. Their collective wealth exceeded the Roman treasury. They commanded political networks that had controlled Rome for generations, and not one of them had ever faced combat. Not one had commanded a century in battle. Not one understood the difference between numerical superiority on parchment and tactical reality on a battlefield. Marcus Porcius Cato, the moral voice of the Senate faction, was particularly vocal. Cato had spent his entire career in Rome giving speeches about virtue, honor, and republican values. He'd never left Italy for military service. Now he sat in war councils lecturing Pompey about military strategy, insisting that attacking Caesar's weakened force was not just tactically sound, but morally necessary. Cato argued that every day they delayed was another day Caesar's criminal behavior went unpunished. To him, warfare was about justice, not logistics. Metellus Scipio, Pompey's father-in-law, was even worse. Scipio had bought his way into the Senate through inherited wealth and political connections. His only military experience consisted of ceremonial duties in Spain, where he'd never seen actual combat. Yet Scipio stood in council meetings arguing that Pompey's refusal to attack was personal cowardice. He pointed to the numerical advantage, 45,000 against 22,000, and insisted victory was mathematically guaranteed. Think about that arrogance. A man who'd never commanded troops in battle telling Rome's greatest living general how to fight. The council meetings became increasingly toxic. On August 2nd, Lentulus Crus, one of the consuls who'd fled Rome with Pompey, openly accused Pompey of treason. He claimed Pompey was deliberately avoiding battle to preserve his own power, that a quick victory would diminish Pompey's political importance. Other senators joined in. They questioned whether Pompey had secretly communicated with Caesar. They suggested he was afraid his reputation couldn't survive defeat. The attacks were personal, vicious, and relentless. Pompey, sitting in these meetings, tried to explain military reality. He showed them supply reports indicating Caesar's army would collapse within 2 weeks. He pointed out that Caesar's desperation made him dangerous, that starving men fought with reckless fury because they had nothing to lose. He reminded them that Caesar had won battles in Gaul against worse odds. The aristocrats dismissed every argument. They saw Caesar's challenge to battle as proof of weakness. They saw Pompey's caution as cowardice. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about those final councils. Pompey's senior officers, the actual combat veterans, all supported waiting. His cavalry commanders advised patience. His engineers reported Caesar's fortifications were weakening daily. Every professional soldier in Pompey's camp understood that time was their greatest weapon. But the Senate faction outvoted them. In the Roman political system that Pompey still respected, political authority trumped military expertise. The aristocrats wanted their victory, and they wanted it immediately. On August 6th, after another brutal council meeting where senators literally shouted over Pompey's objections, Pompey stood and made his announcement. They would attack on August 9th at Pharsalus. The senators erupted in celebration. Wine was distributed. Some began planning their triumph celebrations for when they returned to Rome. They started dividing Caesar's property among themselves, arguing over who would get which estates, which positions, which spoils. Pompey walked out of his command tent that night and stood alone, staring at Caesar's distant campfires. His officers found him there an hour later, silent, motionless. One of them, a veteran tribune named Labienus, who defected from Caesar's army, asked if the general had orders. Pompey's response, recorded in multiple sources, was chilling. We're going to give them the battle they demanded, and we're all going to pay for it. 3 days later, on a dusty plain in central Greece, Pompey would learn exactly how right he was. The battlefield was a flat plain in central Greece, roughly 2 miles wide, bordered by the Enipeus River on one side and low hills on the other. Pompey chose his ground carefully. He positioned his 45,000 infantry on rising ground, his right flank anchored against the river where Caesar couldn't outflank him. His left flank extended toward the open plain, protected by his 7,000 cavalry, the largest cavalry force assembled in Roman history. Behind the cavalry stood auxiliary archers and slingers, thousands of them, recruited from across the eastern provinces. The position was nearly perfect. Pompey's infantry outnumbered Caesar's 2-1. His cavalry outnumbered Caesar's 7-1. He held the high ground. His men were well-fed, rested, and confident. Caesar's 22,000 legionaries marched onto the plain on August 9th, 48 BC, and saw exactly what Pompey wanted them to see: an unbeatable position defended by an overwhelming force. Caesar's officers looked at the odds and felt the first whispers of doubt. But Caesar had seen something Pompey hadn't: a flaw in the perfect position, a weakness in the overwhelming strength. And he was about to exploit it in a way that would change warfare forever. The terrain advantage was crushing. Pompey's infantry stood on ground that rose approximately 30 feet over a distance of 400 yards. Not a dramatic slope, but enough that Caesar's men would be charging uphill, burning energy they didn't have, into fresh troops who'd simply wait and meet them with superior numbers. The Enipeus River on Pompey's right eliminated any possibility of flanking that side. The water was only waist deep, but crossing under fire was suicide. Pompey had effectively reduced the battlefield to a single approach: straight ahead, uphill, into overwhelming force. Let those numbers sink in. 45,000 infantry in 3 solid lines versus 22,000 exhausted, starving legionaries. 7,000 cavalry massed on one flank versus Caesar's 1,000. Behind Pompey's cavalry waited another 3,000 auxiliary archers, Eastern specialists who could put 15 arrows per minute into Caesar's exposed right flank once the cavalry swept around it. The mathematical certainty of Pompey's victory was so obvious that his officers had begun discussing the pursuit phase: how they'd chase Caesar's broken army across Greece and capture the criminal general alive. Caesar rides along his lines that morning, studying Pompey's formation with the intensity of a man reading his own death warrant. His officers crowd around him, pointing out the obvious problems. The 10th Legion's commander, a grizzled centurion named Publius Sulla, speaks what everyone's thinking. Quote 2, Caesar doesn't respond immediately. He's watching Pompey's cavalry, 7,000 riders arranged in dense formation on the Pompeian left, positioned to sweep around Caesar's weak right flank and crush his entire army from behind. Here's what Caesar sees that no one else does. Pompey's cavalry, that overwhelming advantage, is concentrated in a single massive formation. They're not spread out. They're not positioned in depth. They're bunched together like a bronze fist, designed to deliver one devastating blow. That concentration is their strength. But it's also their weakness. If that cavalry breaks, if those 7,000 riders flee, they won't just remove themselves from the battle. They'll expose Pompey's entire left flank. They'll leave the auxiliary archers defenseless. They'll create a gap that Caesar's veterans could exploit to roll up Pompey's entire line from the side. The question is simple. How do you break 7,000 cavalry with 1,000? Caesar has spent the last hour studying those riders, watching how they move, how they're positioned, what kind of men they are. And he's noticed something critical. These aren't hardened Eastern cavalry. They're Roman aristocrats, young nobles playing at war, men who've grown up hearing stories about glorious cavalry charges, but have never faced infantry willing to destroy them personally. Caesar turns to his officers and gives an order that violates every principle of Roman military doctrine. He's going to create a fourth line, hidden from Pompey's view. with specific instructions that sound like madness. Those instructions will either save his army or doom it completely. And he has exactly 2 hours to prepare before Pompey's drums signal the attack that will decide who rules the Roman world. At first light on August 9th, 48 BC, both armies formed for battle. Pompey's 45,000 infantry stretched across 1,500 yards of front, organized into traditional triple lines. His 7,000 cavalry massed on his left flank like a bronze tsunami, ready to sweep around Caesar's weak right and crush his entire army from behind. Caesar's 22,000 men formed opposite. Thin lines stretched nearly to breaking to match Pompey's front. The 10th Legion, Caesar's most veteran unit, held the right flank, the position of honor and maximum danger. The 9th and 8th Legions held the center. The discipline was absolute. These men had fought together for a decade. They'd killed over 1 million Gauls, captured another 1 million, and conquered territory the size of modern France. They'd built fortifications, siege works, bridges, and roads across wilderness that had never seen Roman power. They were hungry, outnumbered, and facing impossible odds. And they were ready. Pompey addressed his troops with confidence, reminding them that Caesar's men were exhausted and starving. Caesar walked along his lines, speaking quietly to his centurions, and then gave an order that shocked everyone. "Today we take no prisoners." His men understood. This wasn't war. This was extermination. The visual contrast was stark. Pompey's legionaries stood in fresh tunics, polished armor catching the morning sun, shields painted with unit insignia that gleamed like mirrors. They'd eaten full rations that morning: bread, salted pork, olive oil, wine diluted with water. They'd slept in proper camps with defensive ditches and palisades. They looked like what they were: the army of the Roman Senate, well supplied, professionally equipped, overwhelmingly numerous. Caesar's men looked like survivors of an apocalypse. Their armor was dented, repaired with leather strips and wire. Their shields showed bare wood where paint had worn away. Many wore tunics so patched and threadbare they were barely recognizable as military uniform. They'd eaten nothing that morning because there was nothing to eat. Some had chewed leather straps just to have something in their stomachs. But their formation was perfect. Shields locked, spacing precise, every man in position. That discipline, maintained through starvation and desperation, was more terrifying than any fresh equipment. Think about what those 22,000 men represented. The 10th Legion alone had been with Caesar since the start of the Gallic Wars. They'd fought in 53 major engagements and won every single one. The veterans in those ranks had personally killed dozens of enemies each. They'd perfected the brutal mechanics of Roman close combat until it was reflex, muscle memory, instinct. A Gallic warrior might be brave. A Germanic tribesman might be fierce. But a Roman legionary from Caesar's army was a professional killer who'd been training for a decade to do one thing: destroy whoever stood in front of him. Here's what made Caesar's no prisoners order genuinely shocking. Romans didn't fight that way. Not against other Romans. Civil wars had rules, unwritten but understood. Captured soldiers could surrender. Officers could be ransomed. There was always the possibility of reconciliation after victory. Caesar's order eliminated all of that. This wouldn't be a political defeat. This would be annihilation. Every man in Pompey's army who didn't flee would die on this field. Caesar's centurions passed the order down the ranks. No quarter, no mercy, no prisoners. The response from the legionaries was immediate. They began striking their shields with their gladi, creating a rhythmic clang that echoed across the plain. Not a war cry, not a cheer. Just the sound of 22,000 swords beating against 22,000 shields in perfect synchronization. The message to Pompey's army was clear. We're coming, and we're not stopping until you're all dead. Pompey watches this display from his command position and feels something he hasn't felt in 30 years of warfare. Genuine fear. These aren't men preparing for battle. They're predators preparing to feed. The discipline, maintained through starvation, is inhuman. The synchronized shield beating sounds like the march of death itself. For the first time, Pompey wonders if numerical superiority will be enough. At precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, Caesar raises his arm. The shield beating stops. 22,000 men stand in absolute silence, waiting for the order that will send them charging uphill into twice their numbers. Caesar looks at his 10th Legion on the right flank, the men who'll face Pompey's cavalry charge. He knows most of them will die in the next hour. They know it too, and not one of them steps back. Caesar drops his arm. The drums begin, and the Battle of Pharsalus explodes into history with a sound like civilization tearing itself apart. Traditional Roman tactics called for both sides to charge simultaneously, meeting in the middle with the crash of shields, swords, and momentum. At Pharsalus, Pompey ordered his infantry to hold position and let Caesar's men exhaust themselves charging uphill. It was sound strategy. Make the tired, hungry enemy run across open ground. Tire them further, then meet them with fresh strength. Caesar's legionaries began their advance at the normal measured pace. Shields locked, ranks perfect. The mechanical precision of professional killers moving as a single organism. At 200 yards, they broke into a run. At 100 yards, they raised their pila, ready to release the volley that preceded every Roman charge. Then something happened that hadn't happened in Roman warfare before. Caesar's men stopped. They stopped mid-charge, 100 yards from the enemy, and stood there, breathing hard, reforming their lines. Pompey's infantry, confused, waited. Caesar's centurions barked orders. The legionaries caught their breath, adjusted their grips, and charged again. This time, they didn't stop. They hit Pompey's lines like a collapsing wall, and the sound of 22,000 men slamming into 45,000 echoed across the plain like thunder. The Battle of Pharsalus had begun. Here's why that mid-charge halt was revolutionary. Roman doctrine assumed continuous momentum from charge to impact. Breaking that momentum was considered suicidal because it gave the enemy time to react, to brace, to prepare. But Caesar understood something about his starving men. They couldn't sustain a 400-yard charge uphill without collapsing from exhaustion before contact. So he innovated. Advance 200 yards. Stop. Catch your breath. Reform lines. Then hit them with everything you have left. The Pompeian soldiers, watching this unprecedented maneuver, didn't know whether to charge forward or hold position. That confusion bought Caesar's men the 30 seconds they needed. The second charge covered 100 yards in approximately 15 seconds. Caesar's front line, roughly 8,000 legionaries, hit Pompey's first line with the combined force of exhausted desperation and professional discipline. The pila volley came first. 16,000 javelins, 6 feet long, iron-tipped, designed to punch through shields and armor. The volley hit Pompey's front ranks at a distance of 20 feet. Hundreds of men went down immediately. Then came the shield crash. When legions collide, the sound is unlike anything in modern warfare. It's not the crack of gunfire or the boom of artillery. It's the wet crunch of wood, metal, and human bodies slamming together at full speed. Shields splintered, Bones broke. Men in the front ranks were crushed by the momentum of thousands behind them pushing forward. The front 3 rows of both armies became a compressed mass of struggling, stabbing, dying soldiers packed so tightly they couldn't fall down when killed. Bodies were held upright by the pressure of living men fighting over them. The initial collision killed approximately 400 men in the first 30 seconds. Think about that rate of death. 400 lives ended in half a minute, not from artillery or disease, but from Romans stabbing Romans with gladii designed for exactly this purpose. The short Roman sword, 18 inches of iron, wasn't meant for slashing. It was meant for punching through ribs, piercing organs, killing efficiently in close quarters where there was no room to swing. And Caesar's veterans had perfected the technique over a decade of constant warfare. But here's where Pompey's numerical superiority began to matter. His second line pushed forward, replacing casualties, adding fresh weight to the grinding combat. His third line waited in reserve, ready to rotate in when the second line tired. Caesar had no third line. He'd stripped it to create his secret fourth line. His men would have to hold with just 2 lines against 3. The mathematics were brutal. For every Caesarian soldier, there were 2 Pompeians. Eventually, sheer numbers would grind Caesar's army into the dust. Pompey, watching from his command position, sees exactly what he expected. His lines are holding. His numerical advantage is working. Caesar's starving soldiers are fighting with desperate fury. But fury doesn't win battles against disciplined numbers. In another 30 minutes, maybe an hour, Caesar's front lines will break from exhaustion. Then Pompey's reserves will surge forward, and the slaughter will begin. Everything is proceeding according to plan. But Pompey doesn't see what's happening on his left flank. His 7,000 cavalry are beginning their flanking charge. And Caesar's hidden fourth line is waiting for them with orders that will turn this entire battle into a nightmare Pompey never imagined possible. While the infantry lines crashed together in the center, Pompey's 7,000 cavalry launched their flanking attack. They swept around Caesar's right wing, a mass of horseflesh and aristocratic confidence, intending to roll up Caesar's flank and crush his army from behind. Caesar's 1,000 cavalry, outnumbered 7 to 1, met them briefly, then broke and fled exactly as Caesar had ordered. Pompey's cavalry pursued, shouting in triumph, certain that victory was moments away. Then they saw the fourth line, 3,000 legionaries advancing in perfect silence, pila held like spears, not raised to throw. Pompey's cavalry, expecting fleeing enemies or the backs of Caesar's infantry, suddenly faced a wall of steel points aimed at their faces. The Romans charging at them weren't behaving like infantry. They weren't forming a defensive wall. They were advancing deliberately, with their javelins positioned to thrust upward into faces, throats, and eyes. The psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. These were aristocratic Romans, young men from wealthy families who'd grown up hearing about glorious cavalry charges and heroic combat. The idea of having their faces torn apart by infantry spears was unthinkable, terrifying, emasculating. The front ranks tried to wheel away. The ranks behind pushed forward. The formation collapsed into chaos. The cavalry charge had begun with textbook precision. 7,000 riders in formation, moving at what cavalry commanders called the controlled gallop. Whilst roughly 20 miles per hour, covering ground in a bronze wave that should have been unstoppable. The horses alone weighed half a ton each. Combined momentum of 7,000 mounted warriors hitting infantry from the side was supposed to be catastrophic. Roman military doctrine held that cavalry versus infantry resulted in automatic cavalry victory, unless the infantry had prepared defensive positions with stakes and ditches. Caesar's fourth line had neither. They just stood there, waiting. Here's what made Caesar's tactic genuinely revolutionary. The pilum, the Roman javelin, was designed to be thrown. 7 feet long, wooden shaft with an iron tip, weighted to punch through shields at 30 yards. Roman soldiers trained their entire careers to throw pila, not thrust them, but Caesar had studied Gallic cavalry tactics for 9 years. He'd watched Germanic riders charge his lines. He'd learned that horses, despite their size, will not willingly charge into a solid wall of pointed objects. And riders, despite their training, will flinch when weapons are aimed at their faces. Caesar's fourth line had specific, brutal instructions. Don't throw your pila. Hold them like spears. When the cavalry comes within 10 feet, thrust upward. Aim for faces, throats, horses' eyes. The goal isn't to kill. The goal is to terrify. Make them understand that charging forward means having their faces destroyed. Make them choose between glory and permanent disfigurement. Caesar was betting that aristocratic vanity would break before aristocratic courage. The front ranks of Pompey's cavalry hit that wall of upward-pointed javelins and recoiled. Horses reared. Riders pulled back on reins instinctively when iron points came at their eyes. The charge lost momentum immediately. The aristocratic Romans in the front ranks, seeing their faces about to be torn apart, wheeled their mounts sideways. The second rank, still moving forward at full speed, crashed into the first rank. Horses collided. Riders fell. The perfect formation dissolved into a struggling mass of confused cavalry, trying to turn around while infantry advanced into them methodically. Think about what happened in the next 60 seconds. 7,000 cavalry, Rome's decisive advantage, broke without inflicting a single casualty on Caesar's fourth line. They didn't fight. They didn't charge again. They fled. Contemporary accounts describe cavalry officers screaming orders that nobody followed. The aristocratic riders simply turned their horses and ran, abandoning the battlefield, abandoning their supporting infantry, abandoning Pompey. The rout was total, immediate, and absolutely devastating to Pompey's entire tactical plan. Behind the fleeing cavalry stood 3,000 auxiliary archers and slingers, Eastern specialists recruited to support the cavalry charge. These men, carrying bows and slings instead of shields and armor, expected to advance behind victorious cavalry and shoot into Caesar's exposed flanks. Instead, they watched 7,000 Roman cavalry flee past them in panic. Then they looked forward and saw 3,000 legionaries advancing with blood in their eyes. The auxiliaries broke without fight. They scattered across the plain, running for Pompey's camp, dropping their weapons, abandoning their positions. In less than 5 minutes, Pompey's entire left flank had ceased to exist. 7,000 cavalry plus 3,000 auxiliaries, 10,000 men total, had been neutralized by 3,000 infantry who hadn't even thrown their javelins yet. The mathematical advantage that should have won the battle had evaporated. And Caesar's fourth line, having accomplished the impossible, now turned left and began marching toward the rear of Pompey's main infantry line. The trap was sprung, and Pompey was about to learn that numerical superiority means nothing when your formations collapse. What happened next at Pharsalus became legendary in Roman military history and incomprehensible to modern students of ancient warfare. Pompey's 7,000 cavalry, the decisive advantage, the overwhelming force that should have won the battle, broke and ran. Not after prolonged fighting, not after heavy casualties. They broke after the first contact with Caesar's fourth line. Contemporary accounts, including Caesar's own commentarii and letters from soldiers who fought there, describe cavalrymen throwing down their weapons and fleeing at full gallop back toward Pompey's camp. Some didn't stop there. They rode for miles, abandoning the battle entirely. The auxiliary archers and slingers who'd been positioned behind the cavalry, expecting to support a victorious charge, suddenly found themselves exposed and alone. Caesar's fourth line, having shattered the cavalry with barely a fight, turned on these auxiliaries and cut them down systematically. Within 20 minutes of the cavalry charge beginning, Pompey's left flank had ceased to exist. His decisive advantage had evaporated. And Caesar's fourth line, 3,000 men who'd just done the impossible, now wheeled left and slammed into the rear of Pompey's main infantry line. The trap was sprung. The speed of the cavalry collapse was unprecedented in Roman military history. From initial contact to full rout, approximately 4 minutes. Let that sink in. 4 minutes for 7,000 cavalry to transform from Rome's decisive advantage into a fleeing mob of terrified aristocrats. Contemporary sources describe cavalry officers screaming themselves hoarse, trying to rally their men. Nobody listened. The front ranks had seen what awaited them. Iron points aimed at faces, legionaries advancing with mechanical precision, and they'd made a calculation. Survival trumped glory. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about that rout. The fleeing cavalry didn't just abandon the battlefield. They spread panic like a plague. As they galloped past Pompey's infantry positions, soldiers in the rear ranks saw 7,000 riders fleeing in terror and assumed the battle was lost. Some units wavered. Officers had to physically restrain men from following the cavalry's example. The psychological impact of watching your supposed decisive advantage collapse in minutes cannot be overstated. Pompey's infantry, still fighting Caesar's front lines, suddenly had doubt creeping into their ranks. The auxiliary massacre that followed was systematic and brutal. 3,000 archers and slingers, recruited from Syria, Anatolia, and Crete, stood exposed when the cavalry fled. These men carried light weapons designed for ranged combat. No shields, minimal armor. They were support troops who'd never expected to face Roman heavy infantry in close combat. Caesar's fourth line hit them like wolves hitting sheep. The auxiliaries tried to run. Most didn't make it 50 yards. Roman legionaries, trained to close distance quickly, caught them in the open and cut them down from behind. Contemporary casualty estimates suggest 2,000 auxiliaries died in less than 10 minutes. The survivors fled toward Pompey's camp, abandoning weapons, stripping off equipment to run faster, screaming warnings that nobody could hear over the battle noise. Think about what Caesar's fourth line had accomplished in 20 minutes. They'd broken 7,000 cavalry without losing a single man. They'd slaughtered 2,000 auxiliaries while taking minimal casualties. And they'd neutralized 10,000 of Pompey's troops, roughly 20% of his total force, through a tactical innovation that violated every principle of Roman military doctrine. The fourth line wasn't supposed to exist. Infantry wasn't supposed to defeat cavalry. Pila weren't supposed to be used as spears. But Caesar had gambled that psychology could overcome numerical advantage, and he'd been catastrophically right. Now comes the moment that military historians study as the perfect tactical encirclement. Caesar's fourth line, 3,000 legionaries who'd just done the impossible, execute a left wheel. In perfect formation, maintaining their lines, they turn 90 degrees and begin advancing toward the rear of Pompey's main infantry force. Pompey's soldiers, engaged in brutal close combat with Caesar's front lines, don't see them coming. Roman legionaries trained to fight with enemies in front, shields forward, swords ready. They never trained for attacks from behind. The fourth line closes the distance at a measured march. No running, no shouting. Just 3,000 professional killers advancing in perfect silence toward the backs of 45,000 infantry who don't know they're about to be trapped between two forces. Caesar, watching from his command position, can see the entire battlefield. His front lines are holding despite being outnumbered. His fourth line is in position. The cavalry threat is eliminated. Everything has worked exactly as planned. But the battle isn't won yet. His starving men still have to break through superior numbers. And Pompey's infantry, despite the cavalry disaster, still outnumbers Caesar's force 2-1. At 8:37 a.m., approximately 40 minutes after the battle began, Caesar's fourth line hits the rear of Pompey's left wing. The effect is immediate and catastrophic. Pompey's soldiers, feeling steel entering their backs, turn around in panic. Formations break, officers lose control. And in that moment of chaos, Caesar's front lines, the starving veterans who'd been grinding against superior numbers for 40 minutes, surge forward with renewed fury. Pompey's army is now caught between two forces, unable to defend front and rear simultaneously, and the slaughter is about to begin. Pompey the Great stood on a small hill overlooking the battlefield and watched his perfect plan disintegrate in less than an hour. His cavalry had fled. His left flank had collapsed. His center was being massacred. Men were dying by the thousands, and there was nothing he could do. According to multiple contemporary sources, including accounts from senators who were present, Pompey removed his general's cloak, mounted a horse, and fled the battlefield while the fighting was still raging. He didn't attempt to rally his troops. He didn't lead a counterattack. He didn't even wait to see the final outcome. He simply left. The greatest general Rome had produced. The man who'd conquered the East, the teenage butcher who'd earned a triumph before he was legally old enough to hold office, abandoned his army and rode for the coast. The symbolism was devastating. Roman soldiers, even in desperate situations, could rally around their commander. But when word spread through Pompey's lines that their general had fled, the last remnants of cohesion vanished. Some units tried to fight on. Others threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Most simply ran, and Caesar's legionaries pursued them with orders to show none. The timeline of Pompey's departure is documented with unusual precision. At 9:15 a.m., approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes after battle commenced, observers noted Pompey removing his distinctive general's cloak, the paludamentum, the scarlet cape that marked him as commander. He handed it to an aide without a word. At 9:17 a.m., he mounted a horse. At 9:18 a.m., he turned the horse away from the battlefield and began riding east toward the coast. Think about that. The battle was still raging. His center was still fighting. Thousands of his soldiers were still alive, still holding formation, still believing their commander was directing the battle. And Pompey just left. Here's what makes this moment genuinely shocking in the context of Roman military tradition. Roman generals didn't abandon their armies. Not ever. Even in catastrophic defeats, commanders stayed until the end. Varus, when 3 legions were annihilated in the Teutoburg forest, died with his men. Crassus, when his army was destroyed by the Parthians, remained until he was killed. The expectation wasn't just tactical. It was moral, cultural, fundamental to Roman military identity. A general's duty was to lead until victory or death. There was no third option. But Pompey, watching his numerical advantage dissolve into chaos, made a calculation that destroyed his reputation forever. He could stay and die with his army, or he could flee and possibly rebuild. He chose survival. Contemporary sources, particularly the senator Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who witnessed the flight, describe Pompey's face as completely blank, emotionless, like a man in shock. He wasn't making a tactical withdrawal. He was running from reality itself. The psychological impact on Pompey's troops was immediate and catastrophic. Roman armies functioned through chain of command. Soldiers looked to their centurions, centurions looked to their tribunes, tribunes looked to the general. When the general disappeared, the entire structure collapsed. At 9:23 a.m., roughly 5 minutes after Pompey fled, a centurion on Pompey's left wing noticed the command post was empty. He turned to his tribune, asking for orders. The tribune had none. He looked toward where Pompey should be and saw nothing. Word spread through the ranks like wildfire. The general is gone. Units that had been fighting cohesively began to disintegrate. Soldiers looked at each other with the same question. If the general fled, why are we still here? Some centurions tried to maintain order, screaming that the battle could still be won, that they had to hold formation. But the mathematics of morale were brutal. If your commander doesn't believe victory is possible, why should you die trying to achieve it? At 9:28 a.m., 10 minutes after Pompey's departure, the first mass surrenders began. Entire cohorts threw down their weapons. Some raised their hands, others turned and ran. Caesar, watching from his command position, sees Pompey's abandoned command post and understands immediately what's happened. His enemy, the man he'd chased across the Mediterranean for 17 months, has broken. Not his army. Him personally. Caesar gives the order he's been waiting to give since crossing the Rubicon. Total pursuit. No prisoners, no quarter. Hunt them down. What followed wasn't battle anymore. It was extermination. Caesar's 22,000 starving legionaries, who'd been outnumbered 2-to-1 an hour ago, now chased 45,000 demoralized soldiers across the plain of Pharsalus with orders to kill everything that moved. The casualty figures were about to become the most lopsided in Roman Civil War history. And the Republican army that should have saved Rome was about to cease to exist. Caesar's legionaries stormed into Pompey's camp expecting military supplies. What they found was something else entirely. Luxury that bordered on obscenity. The aristocratic senators who'd pressured Pompey to fight had prepared for victory with grotesque confidence. Their tents contained silk couches, silver dining sets, imported wines, and elaborate meals prepared by personal chefs. Gardens had been planted with flowers. Some tents had been decorated with ivy and myrtle wreaths in anticipation of triumph celebrations. These men, who'd never faced combat, who'd demanded battle from the safety of Pompey's headquarters, had been so certain of victory they'd already planned their victory feast. Caesar's veterans, who'd been eating grass 2 days ago, walked through this display of aristocratic decadence with growing fury. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Senators dining on imported delicacies while ordering legionaries to die. The political implications were immediate. These weren't Rome's defenders. They were parasites who'd learned too late that wealth and political connections meant nothing against disciplined legionaries led by a tactical genius. Caesar reportedly walked through the captured camp and said quietly, "They wanted this. They forced this battle." Then he ordered his men to take everything. The senators fled in whatever they could find, most on foot, their dignity shattered along with their army. The inventory of Pompey's camp, documented by Caesar's quartermasters, reads like an inventory of imperial excess. Senator Lentulus Spinther's tent contained 12 amphora of Falernian wine, the most expensive vintage in Rome, worth roughly 6 months of a legionary's salary per bottle. Marcus Cato's quarters included a traveling library of Greek philosophy texts bound in leather. Metellus Scipio had brought his personal chef, 3 servants, and enough imported garum fish sauce to last 6 months. Think about that. These men had packed for a luxury camping trip, not a military campaign. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. The senators had already divided Caesar's property among themselves. Written documents found in Lentulus' tent listed estates, slaves, and wealth that would be confiscated after Caesar's expected defeat. They'd assigned themselves positions in the post-victory government. They drafted proscription lists naming Caesar's supporters who would be executed. Some had even composed victory speeches they planned to deliver in the Senate. The arrogance wasn't just personal. It was systematic, institutional. A worldview where military victory was assumed because their side represented legitimate authority. Caesar's legionaries walked through this display and saw everything they'd been fighting against. Here were men who'd never missed a meal criticizing soldiers for being hungry. Here were aristocrats who'd inherited wealth lecturing veterans about duty. Here were politicians who'd never held a sword demanding that others die for causes they'd never risked their lives defending. The fury wasn't just about the luxury. It was about the fundamental injustice of Rome's political system, where incompetent aristocrats commanded and competent soldiers died. The food supplies alone were staggering. Pompey's quartermasters had stockpiled enough grain to feed 45,000 men for 6 months. Caesar's men had been eating grass 48 hours ago. They found warehouses full of salted pork, olive oil, wine, dried fruit, cheese, bread still warm from the ovens. The camp kitchens were preparing lunch when Caesar's troops arrived. Roasted chickens, fresh vegetables, honey cakes. The kind of meal Caesar's veterans hadn't seen in months. But here's what the chroniclers tried to hide about what happened next. Caesar's men didn't just loot the camp. They destroyed it with methodical fury. Silver dining sets were melted down. Silk couches were burned. Imported wines were poured into the dirt. The message wasn't about theft. It was about justice. These aristocrats had forced a battle that killed 15,000 Romans because they couldn't accept that a man from outside their class might rule Rome. Their luxury, purchased with wealth extracted from provinces they'd never visited, was being reduced to ash by soldiers who'd actually built Rome's empire. Caesar walks through his men's destruction and doesn't stop them. He understands what's happening. This isn't looting. It's revolution. The Roman Republic, built on the idea that aristocratic birth determined political power, is dying in this camp along with the senator's dignity. His veterans, seeing the grotesque contrast between their suffering and senatorial comfort, are rejecting the entire system. They're choosing to follow Caesar not because he's legitimate by Republican standards, but because he's competent, loyal to his men, and willing to reward merit over birth. The senators themselves fled in chaos. Cato ran on foot, leaving behind his philosophical texts. Scipio abandoned his personal chef and servants. Lentulus reportedly tried to save his wine collection before realizing his life was more valuable. They scattered across Greece, heading for ships, hoping to reach Egypt or other eastern provinces where they might find sanctuary. Most wouldn't make it. Caesar's cavalry, pursuing the broken Republican army, had orders to capture senatorial commanders alive. The aristocrats who demanded battle from positions of safety were about to face the consequences of their arrogance personally. And the Roman Republic, which had survived 500 years of external threats, was dying from internal rot that had been exposed by 90 minutes of steel and blood on a Greek plain. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he believed he'd find sanctuary with the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, a boy king who owed his throne partly to Pompey's earlier intervention. On September 28, 48 BC, Pompey's ship approached the Egyptian coast near Alexandria. A small boat came out to meet him, carrying Egyptian officials who claimed they would escort him safely to shore. Pompey, exhausted and desperate, accepted. As Pompey stepped into the small boat, one of the Egyptian officials, a Roman officer named Lucius Septimius, who'd once served under Pompey, approached from behind. Contemporary accounts, particularly from Plutarch and Appian, who interviewed witnesses, describe what happened next with precise, horrible detail. Septimius stabbed Pompey in the back. Other Egyptians joined in. Pompey the Great, conqueror of the East, died in a small boat off the Egyptian coast, murdered by men seeking to curry favor with Caesar. The Egyptians cut off Pompey's head and preserved it as a gift for Caesar. When Caesar arrived in Egypt days later and was presented with his rival's severed head, multiple sources report that Caesar wept. Whether from genuine grief, political theater, or the sheer tragedy of how Rome's greatest general had ended, we'll never know. But the message was clear. The Civil War wasn't about personal hatred. It was about power, and Pompey's death changed nothing about Rome's trajectory toward autocracy. Pompey's flight from Pharsalus had been desperate and chaotic. He'd ridden directly to the coast, roughly 60 miles, arriving at the port of Larissa on August 10th, one day after the battle. He abandoned his general's armor, disguised himself in civilian clothing, and boarded a grain ship heading east. For 49 days, he sailed across the Mediterranean, stopping at various ports, seeking allies who might still support him. He found none. Former client kings refused to see him. Cities that had once welcomed him closed their gates. The man who'd reorganized the eastern provinces, who'd installed kings and toppled dynasties, couldn't find a single ally willing to harbor him. Think about that trajectory. From commanding 52,000 troops to fleeing alone in 49 days. From Rome's greatest general to a fugitive begging for sanctuary. The speed of his collapse mirrored the speed of his defeat at Pharsalus. Overwhelming strength to total ruin in less than 2 months. Egypt seemed like his last hope. Pompey had supported Ptolemy the 13th's father, helping secure the dynasty's position against internal rivals. The young pharaoh, only 13 years old, was advised by a council of regents including the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles. These men understood political reality better than Pompey did. Caesar had won. Pompey had lost. Harboring the loser meant war with the victor. The calculation was simple, brutal, and final. Here's what makes Pompey's murder genuinely tragic. Lucius Septimius, the man who stabbed him, had served under Pompey in the Eastern campaigns. He'd fought in Pompey's legions, taken Pompey's pay, benefited from Pompey's victories. Now he was murdering his former commander for Egyptian gold. Pompey recognized Septimius in the final moments before the blade entered his back. Contemporary sources record that Pompey tried to speak, to appeal to their shared history. Septimius stabbed him anyway. The murder itself took approximately 30 seconds. Multiple stab wounds to the back and neck. Pompey fell into the boat's bottom. His wife Cornelia and son Sextus watched from the ship, helpless, screaming, unable to intervene. Egyptian officials held them back. When it was over, they decapitated Pompey's body and left the corpse on the beach. Scavengers found it that evening. The man who'd earned a triumph at age 24 died at 58 in a fishing boat, murdered by a subordinate, his body abandoned like garbage. The Egyptians preserved Pompey's head in cedar oil and brought it to Caesar when he arrived in Alexandria on October 2nd. Caesar had been pursuing Pompey, not to kill him, but to force his surrender, to end the civil war through political reconciliation. Instead, he received a severed head. Multiple sources describe Caesar turning away, weeping, whether from genuine emotion or theatrical display. He ordered Pompey's head buried with full honors, He executed Pothinus for the murder. But the gesture was meaningless. Pompey was dead, the Senate faction was shattered, and Caesar was now the unchallenged master of Rome. The civil war had lasted 20 months from the Rubicon crossing to Pompey's death. It had destroyed the republican system that had governed Rome for 5 centuries. And it had proven that in the struggle between military genius and political legitimacy, genius wins every time. The question now wasn't whether Rome would become an autocracy. The question was what kind of autocracy Caesar would create. The Battle of Pharsalus wasn't just a military victory. It was the execution of the Roman Republic. For 500 years, Rome had been governed, at least theoretically, by the Senate and people of Rome. Power was distributed. Checks and balances existed. No single man could claim absolute authority without facing institutional resistance. Pharsalus ended that forever. With Pompey dead and the senatorial opposition shattered, no force existed that could challenge Caesar. He returned to Rome not as a conquering general, but as a dictator in fact, if not yet in name. The political institutions that had built Rome remained, but they were hollow shells. The Senate met, but it rubber-stamped Caesar's decisions. Elections occurred, but Caesar chose the candidates. The Republic continued to exist in form while dying in substance. Caesar's veterans became the true power in Rome. They'd followed him through Gaul, across the Rubicon, and into civil war. They'd watched him defeat impossible odds through tactical genius. They knew that their fortunes were tied to his success. When Caesar was assassinated 4 years later, his death didn't restore the Republic. It triggered another civil war, won eventually by his adopted son Octavian, who became Augustus, Rome's first official emperor. The 1,000-year arc from Republic to Empire pivoted on that Greek plain in 48 BC, where 22,000 disciplined legionaries proved that training, leadership, and tactical innovation could overcome any numerical disadvantage, and where Caesar demonstrated that the future of Rome belonged not to aristocratic tradition, but to whoever commanded the legion's loyalty. The impossible victory at Pharsalus changed everything, and the Roman Republic never recovered. The casualty figures told the story of Republican extinction. 15,000 Pompeian soldiers dead, another 24,000 captured. Of the 200 senators who'd fled Rome with Pompey, roughly half died at Pharsalus or in the immediate aftermath. The aristocratic class that had governed Rome for centuries was decimated in 90 minutes. Think about that institutional destruction. 200 years of political tradition, family networks, and senatorial authority erased by a single battle. Caesar's losses told the opposite story. 200 dead, roughly 800 wounded. His starving army, outnumbered 2 to 1, had achieved a kill ratio of 75 to 1. The numbers defied every principle of ancient warfare. Larger armies should win. Fresh troops should defeat exhausted ones. Numerical advantage should be decisive. Pharsalus proved that leadership and tactical innovation mattered more than any material advantage. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Caesar's return to Rome in September 47 BC, 15 months after Pharsalus. The Senate declared him dictator for 10 years. Not temporary dictator during emergency, as Republican tradition allowed, but permanent dictator with unlimited authority. The institution that had resisted one-man rule for 5 centuries simply surrendered. They had no choice. Caesar's legions surrounded the city. His veterans filled the streets. Political opposition meant death. The Republican system had operated on a simple principle. Ambitious men competed for power through elections, oratory, and political alliances. but military force stayed outside the city. Generals disbanded their armies before entering Rome. Pharsalus destroyed that separation permanently. Caesar had proven that armies loyal to individual commanders were more powerful than any political institution. The lesson was clear. Control the legions, control Rome. Caesar's dictatorship lasted only 4 years. On March 15th, 44 BC, a group of senators, including Brutus and Cassius, stabbed him to death in the Senate House. They believed killing Caesar would restore the Republic. They were catastrophically wrong. Caesar's assassination triggered 17 years of civil war between his supporters and opponents. The survivors, led by Octavian and Mark Antony, hunted down the assassins. Brutus and Cassius both committed suicide after defeat at Philippi. Eventually, Octavian defeated Antony and became Augustus, Rome's first emperor in 27 BC. The timeline is critical. 49 BC, Caesar crosses the Rubicon. 48 BC, Pharsalus destroys the Republican army. 44 BC, Caesar assassinated. 27 BC, Augustus becomes emperor. 62 years from republic to empire. The entire transformation traced back to 90 minutes on a Greek battlefield, where tactical genius overcame impossible odds. The Roman Empire that emerged from Pharsalus would last another 500 years in the west, 1,500 in the east. It would spread Roman law, language, and culture across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. It would create the political and cultural foundation for Western civilization. All of it traced back to August 9th, 48 BC, when 22,000 starving legionaries proved that discipline, innovation, and leadership could overcome any numerical disadvantage. And when the future of the Western world pivoted on Caesar's decision to create a fourth line that shouldn't have existed and use it to break an army that shouldn't have lost. Pharsalus didn't just change Rome, it changed history.